aging degree from the University of Akron. And currently I am at NYU Steinhardt, teaching lifespan development for mental health and counseling. I'm also at Walsh University, conducting, teaching a variety of courses, whether it be intro, cognitive, stats, you name it. And then I do UX work for a company called Normal Modes, located in Houston, Texas. So I wear multiple hats and do all kinds of things. One area that really interests me is lifespan development, obviously. I've been teaching lifespan development since 2006, and how that intersects with usability overall and information architecture, and kind of what we can do better for different age groupings. So we're going to get into that. So cognitive processes, I hear the term cognitive being thrown around a lot, obviously, in the work we do. Really, what it equates to is those mental processes, whether it be if we're looking at working memory or attention, whether we're looking at perceptual differences, thinking, intelligence, learning, all of that kind of falls into that. And so specializing in cognitive aging at the University of Akron really did kind of put me on the tail end of the lifespan. That's where the focus was on gerontology, but yet we got the entire training, even though it was more focused on older adults. Paul Baltus was a cognitive psychologist and lifespan theorist, and he proposed that lifespan development is lifelong, multi-contextual, bringing in multiple aspects of development, whether it be socio-emotional, cognitive, or physical, multi-directional, meaning change can either be good, bad, or neutral. And then plastic, that we have backup systems, that we have hardwiring, so if one system fails, typically we can compensate, okay? And that we have context and environment playing a role, so basically how it shapes us as individuals, and we carry that dynamic throughout. So how do we extend what we know about cognitive aging literature to information architecture and design? There's quite a good chapter, albeit early and a little bit outdated, from Fisk and Rogers, and it's a human factors chapter in the Handbook of Cognition and Aging. And basically, one of the quotes I pulled that kind of encapsulates today's talk is Rabbits from 1982. It's vital for designers to become aware of the nature and extent of age changes in physical, sensory, and cognitive abilities. Now, in that particular chapter, again, aging is referenced as 65 plus, but these developmental aspects happen again throughout the lifespan and aren't solely, we're not solely talking about cognitive change or physical change with just one subgroup or one category. So, the developmental categories that I'm going to present today are based on general guidelines and stuff that's been already done in the field, as so that it relates to cognitive change in the literature. And so you'll hear me say some things throughout that are maybe a little bit off. Instead of 1 to 6, or it may be 1 to 5 or 3 to 5. Okay? It's because it's not really clear cut, and there's sort of a discrepancy in the actual psych literature for the tech literature and how they conceptualize age groupings. So for our purposes today, I'm going to go through these categories. toddler, preschool, school age, adolescent, young adult, middle adult, and older adult. And you can say, wow, within any of those, that's a 20-year span, there's a lot of variability there, okay? Certainly, absolutely. But for our purposes and with the data that's been generated in the studies we have, we're going to kind of adhere to those groupings, and obviously within a 45-minute time frame, we can't go through everything, even though we might like to. So you might wonder, is information processing really different for these categories? What do you think of this? What is this?
Toy store.
It's a toy store, yeah. It's a very famous toy store. Okay, I'm not going to, yeah, I'm going to say which one. But universally and anecdotally, I would hear something when I would talk to parents about this toy store. I would say, oh, I'm going here. And they'd say, oh, I hate that place. And it was a given. It was the first thing out of their mouths, okay? Who was it designed for? Kids, right. But who were the actual users with the money? Parents, right. So there's a discord, right? And so we need to look no further than this just basic broad example. And you can see here that it's based on categories, right? Not even on gender, but based on shows that are endorsed on one programming unit or on one network that was classified by children, okay? Not by parents. So parents go in and say, well, I don't know, if I can find Minnie Mouse from wherever. The place is chaotic. I go in there and it looks like visual vomit, all right? Well, it makes sense to your kid because it's what your kid is watching and it's how they categorize their world and it fits their mental model, okay? So how do we translate a very tangible example to things that, are online or other services? So again, the literature, there's going to be a little bit of discrepancy in the age classifications. For the most part, in developmental literature, we categorize things through Piaget's model of child development or cognitive development in childhood. So Piaget was a theorist. There were 4 main stages in the model that took you through about 12 plus. And each of these stages, you'll see the first one is sensory motor. It starts from birth to 2. That sensory motor stage actually has 6 sub-stages. And if you're not familiar with psychology or with development, it becomes very granular. As children began to age in Piaget's studies, some of which were his own children, he was off a little bit on the timeline in terms of actual information processing and cognitive changes that we see. But now there are neo-Piagetians and people who have researched development more extensively and who have shifted those classifications. However, for the most part, we see around birth to 2, we have increased usage in some physical activity, but we kind of need to break that apart because that's a large chunk of time. And then with toddlers, we have 2 to 6 in the pre-operational stage. So with each of these stages, you see that certain things are limited, whether it be mobility or certain aspects of cognition and attention. And I kind of want to go through some of that. So in the sensory motor stage, well, let's just start here before I get ahead of myself. According to the National Center for Education, in 2015, approximately 40% of 3 to 4-year-olds use the internet at home. That's a lot, okay? And so it becomes important to, well, how do we design for those 3 to 4-year-olds? And is it ethical? And what sort of design ethics should be in place? But that's, I guess, another talk entirely. But what's going on in this sensory motor stage? Basically, you have from birth to the development and refining of certain memory systems, long-term memory. So we start out, when we're born, being creatures of procedural memory, habits, conditioning, those sort of things. As the child develops, explicit memories or episodic memories become more refined. Around 7 to 9 months of age, explicit memory starts to really take hold. There's development in the frontal lobes that are allowing that to occur, but that development will be occurring gradually throughout their lifespan into their early 20s, okay? So it's not like it's formed and that's what it'll be at that stage. There's gradual development. About 6 to 10 weeks, you get skilled eye tracking and depth perception following thereafter. By 3 months, children begin to categorize their world by basic units, shape, size, color, those sorts of things, okay? And one of the issues is that they lack, obviously, the physical or motor capacity to do anything really else other than just kind of point on a tablet, all right? They lack kind of the smooth, fine motor ability to track and eye-hand coordinate. When we get to our pre-operational stage, we see that there is increased ability, both in cognitive and physical, but still 2 to 6, there's quite a bit of variation there. Your toddlers are going to be obviously less refined cognitively than your 6-year-olds. You do have increased working memory and attentional capacity, but early in development, around 2 to 3, it's more based on task salience, like what's in front of me right now, versus task relevance or goal-directed behavior, okay? So for roughly birth through about 2 or 3, you're gonna get a lot of happenstance behavior in terms of what they're clicking on or what they're doing. For example, I'll go to lunch with my friend and, you know, her is roughly about 30 months. And although she's doing things a little bit better than she was before when she was a little bit younger, we go out to lunch and she still does the typical toddler thing where she's screaming at lunch, you know, and you're just trying to have a conversation and like, here, okay, here's food, you know, shoveling it in, whatever. And she's like throwing food and like, no, I don't want to be here. You guys are boring, you're adults, you know. So first thing we do, most parents do nowadays, is they hand over the iPad or they, here, look at this. Look at this video of Elmo, he's cute, right? All of a sudden they're in your contacts and sending you an email. Okay? It was unintentional, it was not goal-directed, it was by whatever attracted them and a causal and effect type of thing. By the time they shift into 3, 4, 5 range, not only do they become more goal-directed, but also they become able to understand that, hey, if I think about this, I don't actually have to carry it out. I know what the end effect will be, okay? So I don't have to click on this. I know that if I click on this guy, Elmo's gonna say something, okay? But I don't actually have to carry through that activity. They have mental representation, okay? And that early categorization I talked about, and early numerical ability in this age range is going to increase and refine to a point where you can start having subordinate and superordinate categories. So, with that said, there's quite a bit of variability. And I know that this is a lot of verbiage, so please don't hate. I was kind of up late, and I know that it's keep it simple, stupid, but didn't apply today. So how do we alter our IA? How do we design for usability? Well, for birth to 2, obviously design ethics. Some medical professionals say or recommend that there should be no screen time before a year of age based on neural development studies. Others say limited before 18 months, okay? And you're thinking, well, when would you need to have this anyway, okay? Well, my cousin is in the military, and he just had an infant daughter, and he is not able to see her. So they are doing screen time with story time with dad, you know, overseas. And so obviously you have exposure there to screen time and things, but it's in an educational context and there's limited use involved. And so depending on the literature and the given academy, you'll see that limited screen time is recommended. But the organization, again, should focus on those early concepts, shape, color, size, limited numeration, and have that educational component. Semantics, again, should be simplified, if at all, because obviously there's no reading that's occurring, but there is exposure to the written word, which is important. Navigation and search is not relevant, and most are limited to touch screens. I've seen apps where you just pop bubbles, all right, and that category of children likes that. In terms of our 2 to 6 year olds, again, keeping the working memory and attention and things in mind. You have, again, more simplistic categories, but again, at this age, they're not really good at understanding how multi-context situations or multi-representations, okay? So try explaining to your 3-year-old that your mother is their grandmother. No, doesn't work. They're like, what? So grandma's my mommy? No. All right. It won't be until the concrete operational phase, which is our next phase, that they'll start to understand that. So your information architecture elements kind of need to follow suit with that. They're not going to understand different drop-down menus and other representations or synonyms for labeling and so forth. Search queries should be limited, if at all, if they're not needed. This group's not really going to be able to utilize them properly. And if you do have them, partial matching or autocorrect, and again, most of them will bounce or abandon. And then dragging, clicking, and scrolling are very difficult for this group. So again, touch screens and trackpads are optimal. Here you have some interactivity or high amounts of interactivity and color, but you can see the basic structure. One of the things that often is cited as a usability issue is that a lot of children do not make the connection or the causal connection that these things have voiceovers. So if it's not needed, don't put it in because it's just noise at that point. But you can kind of see the category and based on show and so forth. When we get into our school age group, this is Piaget's concrete operational stage. Essentially, we have, again, gradual refinement, but moreover, there's still concrete thinking, okay? Abstract thinking comes much later. So in terms of how they make decisions, in terms of how they conceptualize things, you're going to want to have sort of exact schemes and appropriate representation of different elements that are well defined. So in terms of working memory is really kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Developed, I guess. Not fully, but to a good point. This is the transition time, usually around 3rd grade for a lot of the kids. It's important because it's vital to complete tasks with multiple steps, okay? And so still, if you have anybody kind of before the age of 9, you're going to want to limit the amount of clicks, limit the amount of steps, limit the hierarchies that are involved because they just are kind of blind to it. A lot of people, this is something I've kind of harped about in previous talks, but a lot of people talk about the myth of Miller, 7 plus or minus 2 digits of information, but that's not a myth. what you're doing when you are capitalizing on that is you're chunking, and you're engaging in what's known as a decision complexity advantage. It's a systems engineering concept that cognitive psychology borrowed. So Miller absolutely holds true, and for this age group, you're not going to have necessarily 7 plus or minus 2. You're going to have around 5 to 7, and so you're going to want to limit that. Again, further conceptual refinement, you can start kind of branching out a little bit, but this group actually has quite a bit of eye-hand coordination. But they have self-regulatory issues at times, so they lack patience. And again, it has to do with those frontal areas kind of continually refining. So they'll abandon a task quickly if they feel like it's too hard, or search quickly if they feel like it's taking too long. So in terms of information architecture for this group, again, organization should be fairly simplified and exacting, concrete. In terms of instructions, they need to be goal-directed but not prescriptive. And so really what that means is kind of allowing them to have options or choices for a given interaction or a given behavior, but not necessarily telling them what to do, because word for word telling them what to do will often result in them abandoning, because sometimes they just can't get it figured out. They can now include multiple perspectives, so you can have more detailed hierarchies and organization and or schemes, but they do lack patience overall. So if you get a lot of no search results or error pop-ups, that'll be a problem. And again, even though dragging and clicking are difficult, and they do prefer the trackpad, they do have better ability to navigate. Some of it depends on whether or not the task is simultaneously occurring. So in certain games like Roblox, are you guys familiar with that gaming platform? It'll have you do 2 things at once with both hands, and they'll have difficulty doing that versus a single task. Okay. So here are a couple different, this is Disney XD. You can see kind of the main headings and based on show, and it tells the show, and then when you click on that, it opens a menu, but it's fairly straightforward, simple, visual. This is a nightmare. Yeah. Okay, and this is Nickelodeon. Why they have adopted that design, I don't know, but it's certainly not in line with the 7 to 12-year-old range, and especially what we know about cognition. It's just, and even the readability on it is not all that great, especially with the purple font. So moving right along, and again, because I'm trying to kind of save our time, we see dramatic changes in adolescence. Okay, adolescents go through the most dramatic neural change since infancy. Okay, which a lot of people don't know. But there's a lot going on in terms of development with not only frontal areas, but also the limbic areas, or those emotional processing centers, okay? And there are different groupings for pre- and post-pubescent functioning when we take those emotional centers into account. Primarily post-puberty, there's an apathetic response, and they don't judge emotional features as well as they once did pre-puberty. Okay. So they are less able to adopt appropriate cues for emotional processing, essentially. They are at a very great time in terms of development for their ability to do things in terms of they have increased processing speed, increased ability to think critically, and use basic scientific methodology or deductive reasoning skills that they weren't maybe once able to do before or earlier on. But they're still idealistic in that processing, okay? And just because they haven't, and just because their brains have developed and become closer to what functionally an adult's would be, it doesn't make them as efficient, and it doesn't mean that they're always right. Okay, so they're prone to error. And because there are so many structural changes going on, it also leads to increasing impatience. You'll have an exploratory behavior. So you'll have people engaging in risk-taking issues and other aspects of exploratory behavior, especially online. This real quick is an example. This is MTV. And I just want you to take a look at it before I kind of show you what the literature suggests. You see that the headings are pretty straightforward, simple language, maybe a relevant show, and then some relevant things and maybe an app. But it's fairly straightforward. So what do we see in this group? Organized content needs to be chunked. And the reason it needs to be chunked is because they are learning and bringing in new information more so than before, and they have difficulty making that information efficient with the current structural changes that are going on. So contents can vary, and they become more abstract in their thinking, but again, they're idealistic. And if you get too much of it, too much content or too much dense content or clutter, they kind of get overwhelmed and they back out. All right. So also, research has shown that you need about a simplified or roughly 6th grade reading level for this group because they just don't have the patience to read. So if it's too much, like if I showed them this, they'd be like, I'm gone. Again, navigation, too much clicking or hunting, tab browsing, scrolling. Contrary to popular belief, adolescents don't just go on and mindlessly web surf. They actually do have goals in mind. They may not be like your goals, but they are goal-related behaviors, okay? Even if it's just to kill boredom, that's still a goal for 10 minutes while you're in study hall. Search queries, again, need autocorrect like younger groups, and then oftentimes, and this is, I think, the big take-home I want you to get from this group. They're overconfident, they make mistakes often, and in general are less successful than adults in completing online tasks. Okay? So this is really important because who do we usually consider as the most unsuccessful group? Seniors. Yeah. But we have more error going on here because of development. So it's something that needs to be considered and brought to awareness. Now, in terms of adulthood, again, we start increasing the range of age. And so will you have variability in this? Absolutely. Will people hit certain cognitive, physical milestones earlier than others? Absolutely. Am I approaching midlife? No. It was a joke.
You're there already.
Wow. You stop your nonsense.
Somebody's in trouble.
So anyway, point is that to some extent, these cutoffs are subjective, okay? But what do we see? We see that once we hit our 20s, oh man, I missed it. I missed my peak. What is the fluid intelligence versus the crystallized? Okay. So Warner Shai did the Seattle, and colleagues did the Seattle longitudinal study, and cross-sectional and longitudinal data came out of that, but mainly longitudinal data, because that's why it's a longitudinal study. And what they did was they tracked people every few years to see how they measured on certain aspects of intellectual ability, whether it was fluid or crystallized. Fluid ability has to do with things like abstract reasoning, spatial ability, word fluency, inductive reasoning, and things that require processing speed or timed measures, okay? Crystallized abilities, on the other hand, are more like things that are, it's like the software that is acquired over time with experience. And you can see that that makes sense because it gradually increases throughout the lifespan. So when someone conceptualizes aging as inevitable decline, that is just simply a myth and not the case. And the data doesn't support that, okay? We do see declines in fluid intelligence after 20. So processing speed is at its peak in our early 20s, but then after that, it's all downhill. Working memory and attention, we see differences in the type of attention task, okay? So sustained is just focusing on something for a given period of time. Selective is attending to one thing and not another. And then dual task or multitasking is monitoring multiple channels at a given time, okay? So what we see is that for sustained and selective attention, for this group it remains solid. For divided attention though, and task switching, which is important for UXers, we have poor performance and what are known as dual task costs, okay, in performance. So that will become the main issue as we increase with age, is following the intellectual ability trend and also following the attentional trend. So what do we know about IA? Well, I mean, this is the majority of our websites because they're all programmed by people usually and designed in the SAGE range, okay? So sometimes there's not a lot of sensitivity to other aspects of development. So currently what we have, so obviously we want to follow best practices. Paul was in here earlier and cited the polar bear book. Most sites, again, are designed for adult users. We want to avoid jargon, consistency, and labeling. Adults, like teens, don't like hunting, don't like clicking back and forth. And again, their patience levels in the earlier stages, you know, like 20s, 25, that college range, they're going to be more similar to adolescents in their patience level and what they're willing to tolerate versus the ones who are closer to midlife or that 40s range, which are going to have a little bit more patience and kind of wait for something to load or wait for content to come up. All right. Search queries should follow, again, good, just general usability guidelines, increased visibility, magnifying glass, icon, those sorts of things that we all are aware of. And then again, avoiding too much stimulation and things that interactivity that is unnecessary. When we get to midlife, we see another dramatic physical change. And again, if you really take nothing away from here today, take away the fact that the misconceptions you had about seniors or the general popular belief isn't actually where we're seeing the most age-related change or dramatic change, okay? Although it is where we see change, we also see change in other parts of the lifespan. So what do we know about our midlifers? They have physical changes beginning in sensory systems that will implicate how perception is driven and how cognition is developed. And so with that, we see again that fluid abilities are declining, crystallized are again increasing over time, and we know from studies that middle-aged adults will often outperform younger adults in things like concentration, being able to have that sustained attention and patience for a longer period of time, like everybody in this room who's not bored right now. And that there's a high degree of familiarity. So guess what is awesome about aging is that experience acts as a buffer for age-related declines, okay? And so again, we go back to Baltus for our which stands for Selection, Optimization, and Compensation. Did anybody just see Cher perform recently on TV or in Mamma Mia, for example? Anybody see Mamma Mia? The sequel, sure. All right, well, great. What I noticed about her performance is that, she's obviously beyond midlife, okay? But she still sounded just as great. She still performed just as well. But one thing that my eye immediately went to was her gait was a little bit slower, and she was a little bit more steady. And some of her tones and some of her inflections as she was singing became a little bit more concentrated in her effort, especially as she was going down those Greco stairs, okay, and not singing. All right? She was compensating for that decline, but still delivering an excellent performance. All right? And so Baltus would say, well, we do have these losses that are beginning in midlife through primary aging and secondary aging characteristics, but through compensation, through experience, we have these natural buffers built in. So, the NN group, most of you are familiar with. What they have found is that user task completion rate increases by 0.8 per year for this group and beyond. All right? So, and what they generally adhere to is what they refer to as a 5-5-5 rule, which is that basically, and it's confusing, so give me a minute, the slowest 5% of users are about 5 times as slow as the fastest 5% of users. That make sense to anybody?
One more time?
The slowest 5% of users are about as 5 times as slow as the fastest 5% of users. So essentially, what it means is that the slowest users need substantially more time to complete tasks, all right? And some estimates go all the way up to 400% more time, all right, in their calculations. However, over the long term, what does this translate to into actual IA and usability and design factors? Not much. They argue that there's really just not enough statistical significance because essentially by decade you're only really worried about 8%. All right? And that's not markedly different. So for this group, and again they reference that time will tell. The other issue, when you're looking at lifespan development, one of the things that you constantly have to keep in mind is experience and exposure. As I mentioned, experience shapes us, and it, in essence, allows us to learn, obviously, our environment and the things we interact with, and that changes our neural structure and interacts with our heredity, and for the heredity environment interaction. And so you'll have a cohort that will come through that maybe will perform poor just based on experience, whereas subsequent cohorts, like this group of toddlers coming through who've been exposed since they were a year old to a tablet, are going to have markedly different results, plus aging on top of it that you're going to have to account for. Does that make sense? Great. So, later adulthood, 65 plus. There is actually quite a bit of variability, and 65 plus just doesn't do it for this group. All right. In development, we call it 65 plus, and we have the young old, and the old, and the oldest old, and then the centenarians. Okay? And guess what? Centenarians are starting to use computers and learning, all right, and have a bit of plasticity, unlike Baltus ever thought. Okay, still make market errors and are slow with it, but it is occurring. Okay, so time will tell on a lot of this data, but what we do know through Pew Research as early or as recent as 2017. With our 65 to 69 grouping, we had roughly 82% of them saying that they use the internet, and 59% of them owning a smartphone. For 70 to 74 age range, we have roughly 75% using the internet, 49% of them using a smartphone. For the 75 to 79 grouping, we have roughly 60% internet usage and 31% with a smartphone, and 80 plus, 44% internet and 17% with a smartphone. Right? Overall, as a general group of 65 plus, we see about 42% total have some type of smartphone. It's not specified what exact kind. But again, when we look at the data and we break it apart, we see an interaction with educational attainment and income. Okay, and it makes sense. You know, you can have the affordance and, you know, the educational attainment, you are more likely to invest in that technology. The NN group reports that older adults, 65 plus, are roughly 43% slower on tasks. And again, when we look at this, we have to take in a couple of things into account. In general, older adults worry or have anxiety about using technology, but they're willing to use it, and they want to use it, and they think it's cool, okay? So that's really important to keep in mind because a lot of stereotypes go into that. There's also speed accuracy trade-off. So some of the slowing, although it's most likely central nervous system slowing, some of the slowing too in tasks is essentially that they are making more methodical and guided decisions as they're going through, and they're consistent. And so they'll actually slow off on reaction time or response time to make sure that they're thorough, that they've checked everything, and make more cautious decisions, okay, than any other group. When we look at attention, what do we see? Well, for sustained attention, we're good, just as good as younger adults. For simple sustained attention tasks, when we get into complex and more than one, whether it be more than one distractor or whatever, we do see a cost there. Selective attention is hit hard, as well as divided attention. So older adults in general will perform significantly worse with higher dual task costs than other groups. However, with that said, again, you can employ certain methodologies where you have a buffer, and experience, again, is key to this. So in my dissertation, basically what I did, I had a computer program where I had older adults and younger adults look at images in their periphery while focusing on a central set of letters with both targets and distractors, okay? And so not only did they have to make a decision based on what was in this imagery behind a mask that was eventually followed, it was only up for 52 milliseconds, which is incredibly fast, all right? But also, they had to make a judgment on what was in the center, okay? What do you think happened?
They were distracted by the peripheral movements and gave lower scores for what was in the center of the screen.
No,
Didn't happen.
no, it didn't happen. Did you know that they outperformed younger adults? Why do you think that was?
Experience to do one task.
No, it really didn't even have to do with that. It had to do with experience and a lifetime of processing their visual world. They were chunking pieces of information in a holistic fashion. And this is why I say just because aging doesn't inevitably mean decline, okay? So what we found out of this was that younger adults process in a very analytical fashion. They'll look at their visual environment, okay? And it'll take time to integrate all those pieces and all of those elements. Whereas an older adult, through experience, is able to come in and just take a big chunk. And it's much more efficient. Even when you have decrement at the level of the retina, okay? As long as you account for visual acuity and color blindness, and roughly have about 20/40 visual acuity, we find this result almost to the point of true parallel processing, which is remarkable. It's a highly skilled task that they've had a lifetime to obtain. So,
Coping.
an adaptation. Salthouse had similar findings with older typists. He found that older typists were completing work and were able to scan farther characters ahead than younger typists. And so just through the saccadic motion, they were able to have a metric for that and determine that older adults were looking much farther ahead than younger adults and chunking their visual environment. So, how should we design for this group, and how should we take in the decrement, knowing that we do have some slowing, that we do have some systems that are declining, but that also we can't necessarily equate that to inevitability. There's a lot of content here, but basically it should be simplified but not condescending, and avoiding ambiguous stimuli, and if you do have it, such as the hamburger, writing the word menu under it. You know, simple changes make a world of difference for this group, okay? Also, you know, increasing font size in terms of readability, you know, nothing kind of below 16 as a general guideline for best practice, but also avoiding those lower spectrum, whether it be violets or blues, okay? The lens actually yellows and hardens as we age, and thereby it makes violets and blues harder to read and detect in the visual environment. Also, what's interesting about this, and if I haven't already overwhelmed all of you enough, what we see is gender differences in some of this stuff too. I did a transit maps and systems study, and we found that older women were more likely to use landmarks than older men. Okay? So things like that can really make a difference. And one thing that's important to note is, although there is lifespan change, and although you need to account for it as a designer, you also need to understand that there's far more variability within a group than between groups. And so when we get into the nature of diversity and designing for diversity and things of that nature, not only do you have to account for the age-related change or the age-related dynamic, but you also need to account for the fact the person's an individual, and they may differ from the rest. So it can make our job tough. In terms of conclusions, cognitive processes are important to consider, and again, they change gradually, not abruptly in most cases. Designers need to be aware of this and consider them, and in that way we can create humane and practical designs and applications. And then these are my references, and that's what I have for you. We are at 2:12, and we're in break. 3 minutes during your break, or do you guys want to transition? Do you have questions, thoughts? Yeah?
How do you expect things to change as you talked about toddlers and then they so that wasn't something that happened 20 years ago.
Right.
So was there the 65 plus age range there series would be a lot different, I'm assuming, than current 65?
Well, how I expect it to change is much like the results we found in my dissertation. Through a lifetime of that experience, I expect more of the decision complexity advantage and chunking of information. For example, we look at the ecosystems on the internet and how things are designed, like a banking website. That has its own aspect of components that kind of make it its own system. And we have elements that are chunked, like this is where you enter your account information and so forth. So I suspect that through a lifetime of navigation and a lifetime of interaction, you're going to get that chunking and that kind of ecosystem sort of behavior as it continues.
So it seemed like you were telling us that, it's kind of, I don't know, funny about it, but you don't have the skill set to cope with a world that's filled with frustrating machines and systems until you're in your 30s. By the time you're in your 30s, your mental capacity, vastness of your mental capacity is already defined. So it's really kind of sad we can't get it right until we're too slow to start getting it right or something like that.
Well, hopefully though that will change as, you know, with more exposure, but then also too with more exposure, we've got a whole issue with design ethics that needs to kind of be tackled. My talk at World Usability Day was on design ethics and cognitive liberty, and the whole the hooking process that a lot of designers are engaging in. And so we really need to kind of battle that, and like some of the issues that Ben, the keynote was, you know, addressing today, especially if technology is the trend for education and, you know, I mean, you've got ABC Mouse coming into preschools now between 3 and 4, so they're not only getting internet use at home, but they're getting it in their preschool. So, and for certain groups, it's great because it helps them bridge the gap, children of poverty, children who are disabled, but at the same time, with things like screen apnea and changes with neural structures and changing with, you know, overall learning, we really need to be careful and cautious about how we move forward as an industry.
Yeah, you think that we're capable of tracking and making changes that are necessary to avoid harm? Or is it just a situation where we have to cope with it as we uncover it as it happens?
So I had a student say to me that, well, there are no ethics of business and design is business. And I don't like that perspective. I think it's erroneous. And I think that if you can design well, you'll know how to do it without hooking, without trying to make people addicted, without trying to market for the bottom line. You'll do it well and you'll do it good. And hopefully we can do that as an industry. And hopefully the benevolent agenda can be sort of propagated. You know, but again, it depends on your ethical background.
Was that a personal